Picture this. You are standing on a street corner, the dust of the unforgiving West coating your tongue, the sun a merciless hammer in a bleached white sky. Before you, a woman, her frame so thin it seems a strong gust of wind might carry her away, stumbles forward. Her dress is a patchwork of faded calico and desperate repairs. Her face a mask of exhaustion etched with the fine lines of unspeakable sorrow. Clinging to her skirt are two small children, a boy and a girl, their eyes wide and hollow, reflecting not the curiosity of youth but the deep, soul-crushing weariness of starvation. She stops before two men, figures of immense presence and authority. Their long coats, the glint of steel at their hips, and the unyielding set of their jaws mark them as Pinkertons, men who deal in order and consequence. Her voice, when it comes, is not a shout but a dry, rasping whisper that carries more weight than any scream. It is a sound of absolute surrender, the final prayer of a soul at the end of its rope. She looks past the men, her eyes stared sightless at the burning sky, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "Save my children instead of me," she begs, her voice cracking on the last word. "They haven't eaten in 6 days." The taller of the two men, a brute with a sneer permanently etched onto his face, let out a short, cruel laugh. "We ain't a charity, ma'am," he grunted, his gaze dismissing her as if she were no more than a piece of tumbleweed. He made a move to push past her, his disinterest a physical force. But the other man did not move. He was built like a mountain, solid and immovable, his face a landscape of hard-won experience. A pale scar, a relic of some forgotten violence, ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, pulling his lips into a perpetual somber line. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were fixed on the woman, and in their depths something flickered, a ghost of a memory, a pang of an old unhealed wound. He didn't speak. He simply raised a hand, a gesture that stopped his partner cold. He knelt, moving with a deliberate grace that seemed at odds with his powerful frame, bringing himself level with the children. He looked from the boy's gaunt face to the girl's trembling lip, and the hard granite of his expression softened, just for a moment, into something resembling profound grief. He looked back at the woman Alara, whose own eyes were now locked on his, a final, desperate ember of hope kindling within their exhausted depths. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. "Alara," she whispered. "And these are Leo and Clara." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Standing up, he turned to his partner. "You go on ahead, Jackson. I have business here," Jackson scoffed, disbelief warring with the ingrained respect for the man beside him. "Business? Silas, this is vagrancy, not business." Silas's gaze didn't waver. "I said, I have business here." There was a finality in his tone that allowed no argument. Jackson grumbled, spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust, and stalked off toward the saloon, leaving Silas alone with the ghost of a family. Silas turned back to Alara. He reached into his coat, and for a terrifying second, she flinched, expecting a weapon. Instead, he produced a small, leather-bound pouch. He untied it and tipped a few coins into his palm, more money than she had seen in a year. He pressed them into her hand, his fingers calloused and warm against her cold skin. "The hotel at the end of the street. Get a room. Get them food. I will find you in 1 hour." Her throat was too tight to speak. She could only nod, clutching the coins as if they were life itself. As she gathered her children, their small hands disappearing into hers, she looked back at him, her eyes asking the question she could not voice. Why? Silas simply watched her go, the stoic mask back in place. But as they disappeared into the hotel, he allowed his shoulders to slump, just for an instant, and the weight of a decade of regret settled upon him. He wasn't a Pinkerton. Not anymore. He had shed that life like a snake sheds its skin, but the scars, both inside and out, remained. He was just a man living in the shadow of his past, and in Alara's desperate plea, he had heard the echoes of his own failure, a sound he had spent years trying to outrun. An hour later, A knock came at the hotel room door. Alara, who had watched her children devour bread and broth with a ferocity that broke her heart, opened it to find Silas standing there. In his hands he held a bundle of supplies. "You cannot stay here," he said, his tone direct, leaving no room for negotiation. "This town, it chews up people like you. It's no place to raise children. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. We have nowhere else to go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We've been running for weeks." He looked past her, at Leo and Clara, who were now asleep on the lumpy bed, their bellies full for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "Yes, you do," he said, his gaze returning to hers. "I have a cabin, north of here in the high country. It's isolated. It's safe. You can stay there for as long as you need." Alara stared at him, suspicion and hope warring within her. This man was a stranger, a formidable and intimidating presence. The world had taught her that kindness from such men always came at a price she was no longer willing or able to pay. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you want from me?" For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Silas's stoic face. Not anger, but a deep, resonant sadness. "I want nothing from you, ma'am," he said quietly. "There was a time I failed to help a family that needed it. I won't make that mistake again." His earnestness was a palpable thing, a force that disarmed her cynicism. In his storm-gray eyes, she saw not a predator, but a man haunted by his own ghosts. She saw a glimmer of redemption. Taking a deep breath, she made a choice. It was a leap of faith into an unknown darkness, but the alternative was a certainty of despair. "All right," she said, her voice finding a sliver of its former strength. "We will go with you." The journey out of the town of redemption was a silent one. Silas led a sturdy horse, its saddlebags now laden with their few possessions and the supplies he had bought. Alara walked beside him, holding Clara's hand, while Leo, his small legs struggling to keep up, held onto his mother's skirt. They left the dusty streets and the hollow-eyed stairs behind, heading towards the dark line of mountains that clawed at the horizon. With every step away from the town, Alara felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. It was the quiet that came after the storm, the stillness of a world that had been torn apart and was now, perhaps, beginning to heal. The man beside her was a mystery, a silent giant with a past etched into his very skin. But in his presence, for the first time in a long, long time, she didn't feel hunted. She felt safe. The cabin was nestled deep within a grove of ancient pines, a small, sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. A thin plume of smoke curled from its stone chimney, a welcoming banner against the vast, indifferent blue of the mountain sky. To Alara, who had spent the last months sleeping in barns and under open skies, it looked like a palace. Silas pushed open the heavy wooden door, revealing a single, large room. It was sparse but impeccably clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A simple cot was pushed against another, and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. The air smelled of pine, wood smoke, and solitude. "It's not much," Silas said, his voice low as he deposited their supplies on the table. "But it's warm, and no one will find you here." Alara looked around, her eyes taking in the details. The neat stack of firewood beside the hearth, the small shelf of worn books, the polished sheen on the wooden floor. This was not just a shelter. It was a home, a sanctuary built by a man who understood the value of peace. It's everything," she breathed, her voice thick with unshed tears. The first few days were a period of quiet adjustment. Alara, Leo, and Clara took the cot, while Silas laid out a bedroll for himself on the floor by the fire, a silent guardian in the dark. He was a man of few words, his presence as constant and unobtrusive as the mountains outside. He would rise before the sun, the soft thud of his axe splitting firewood the first sound of the new day. He would hunt, returning with rabbits or a deer slung over his shoulder, providing for them with a quiet efficiency that asked for nothing in return. Alara, in turn, began to reclaim her own sense of purpose. She cleaned the cabin with a feverish energy, scrubbing away the last vestiges of her desperate flight. She cooked, turning Silas's game into savory stews that filled the small space with a warmth that went beyond the heat of the fire. She found a small, fallow patch of earth behind the cabin and, using a spade she found in a lean-to, began to turn the soil. It was hard work, her hands quickly blistering, but the feeling of the rich, dark earth under her fingernails was grounding. She was no longer running. She was planting roots. The children, at first timid and watchful, began to thaw under the steady, gentle heat of this newfound stability. Leo, a serious boy who had been forced to grow up too fast, started to follow Silas around, watching him with a wide-eyed fascination. He would observe as Silas cleaned his rifle, sharpened his knives, or mended a piece of leather, asking quiet, intelligent questions. Silas, for his part, answered them with a patience that surprised Alara. He showed the boy how to track a deer, how to identify edible plants, how to carve a simple whistle from a piece of willow. He was teaching the boy not just to survive, but to live in harmony with the wild world around them. Clara, whose laughter had been a forgotten sound, rediscovered it in the dappled sunlight of the forest. She would chase butterflies, her small feet pounding on the soft pine needles, her giggles echoing through the trees. She grew fond of Silas, a man who seemed to her young eyes as large and steadfast as the pines themselves. She would bring him offerings, a brightly colored leaf, a smooth river stone, a wildflower, and he would accept them with a solemn nod, his gruff exterior melting away in the face of her innocent affection. One evening, as a cool autumn rain drummed a gentle rhythm on the roof, they sat around the fire. The children were asleep, their breathing soft and even. The silence between Alara and Silas was no longer tense or awkward, but comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. "You never told me what you're running from," Silas said, his voice a low murmur that blended with the sound of the rain. He was staring into the flames, his face cast in flickering light and shadow, the scar on his cheek a stark white line. Alara hesitated. The story was a heavy one, a burden she had carried alone for so long. But looking at the man across from her, a man who had offered her sanctuary without question, she felt the need to share it, to let the poison out. "My husband, Thomas, he was a farmer," she began, her own gaze dropping to the fire. "He was a good man, a hard worker. But we had a bad year, then another. We had to borrow money from the mayor of our town, a man named Thompson." She paused, the name leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. "Thompson owns everything in that valley. The bank, the general store, the law. When Thomas couldn't pay, Thompson offered him a deal. More time in exchange for Thomas working off the debt on a new railroad survey. It was dangerous work. There was a rockslide." Her voice broke. Thomas was gone, and the debt remained. Silas's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the wooden chair. He knew men like Thompson, men who saw people not as souls but as assets on a ledger. "Thompson came to the farm a week after the funeral," Alara continued, her voice flat, devoid of emotion as she recounted the memory. "He said the debt was now mine. He said the farm was his. And then he made another offer. He said he was a lonely man, that a widow with 2 children needed a husband, a protector. He would forgive the debt if I would marry him." The sheer, predatory ugliness of it hung in the air. "I told him no, I would rather die." He laughed. He said the law was on his side. "He gave me a week to reconsider that night. I packed what little we had, and we ran." She finally looked up at Silas, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I am not a criminal. I am a widow trying to protect her children from a monster." Silas met her gaze, and the storm in his eyes was fearsome. It was not a storm of judgment, but of a deep, cold rage directed at the injustice of the world. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice a raw, guttural sound. "You did the only thing a mother could do." He stood up and walked to the small window, peering out into the rain-swept darkness as if he could see all the way back to her valley, to the man who had caused her so much pain. "Men like Thompson," he said, his back to her. They believe their power makes them gods, but they're just men. And all men can be made to answer for their sins. There was a conviction in his voice, a promise of righteous fury that sent a shiver down her spine. It was in that moment that she understood the truth of him. He was not just a recluse hiding from the world. He was a warrior in exile, a man of immense capability who had chosen peace, but had not forgotten the art of war. The silence that followed was different. It was charged with shared history, with the weight of their respective pasts. Alara had given him her truth, and in his quiet, resolute anger, he had validated her struggle. She looked at this man who had given her children their laughter back, who had given her a place to heal, and she felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. But it was more than gratitude. It was a fragile, burgeoning sense of connection, a feeling she thought had been buried with her husband. Later that night, as she lay on the cot listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing from the floor, she realized the cabin was no longer just his sanctuary. It had become hers, too. It was a fragile fortress against a cruel world, and Silas was its keeper. And for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder not just about the past they were fleeing, but about the future they might be able to build together within its sturdy walls. The seasons began to turn, the vibrant green of summer giving way to the fiery golds and reds of autumn. The routine of life in the cabin became a comforting liturgy. The days were marked by the scent of baking bread, the sound of Leo's increasingly confident chopping of kindling, and Clara's songs as she helped her mother hang laundry on a line strung between two pines. The found family settled into a rhythm that was as natural and steady as the flow of the nearby creek. Alara's garden, once a patch of stubborn soil, now yielded late-season squash and hardy greens. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and capable, a testament to her resilience. She had found a strength in herself she never knew she possessed, a strength forged in the quiet dignity of providing for her family. Silas watched her, and a part of his frozen soul began to thaw. He saw the way she looked at her children, with a love so fierce and pure it was like a physical light. He saw the way she moved about the cabin, her presence turning it from a shelter into a home. He had built this place to be alone, to nurse his wounds in solitude, but with her here, it felt more complete than it ever had. One afternoon, while mending a fence at the edge of the small pasture where he kept his horse, Leo approached him. The boy held a piece of wood he had been carving, a crude but recognizable bird. "Silas," he began, his voice serious, "when my father was alive, he taught me how to mend nets." He looked down at the bird in his hands. "You've taught me how to track and how to read the stars. It's a good feeling." To learn things, Silas stopped his work and looked at the boy. Leo's eyes, once so haunted, now held a steady light. "Your father was a good man to teach you a skill," Silas said, his voice softer than usual. "A man's worth is in what he can build, what he can provide, not what he can take." He placed a large, gentle hand on Leo's shoulder. "You're becoming a fine young man, Leo." He would be proud. The boy's face broke into a rare, brilliant smile, and in that moment, Silas felt a pang in his chest that was not grief, but a profound, aching joy. He was becoming more than a protector. He was becoming a father. Later, as dusk painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose, he and Alara sat on the small porch, watching the children chase fireflies at the edge of the woods. "They're happy here," Alara said softly, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "I haven't seen them this happy since before." "It's a good place," Silas agreed, his gaze fixed on the mountains. "The world is loud. Here you can hear yourself think." Alara turned to look at him, at his strong profile silhouetted against the fading light. "I never properly thanked you, Silas, for everything." "There's no need," he said, still not looking at her. "Then let me ask you something," she persisted gently. "You told me you left the Pinkertons because you failed to help a family. What happened?" The question hung in the cool evening air. The easy quiet between them tensed. Silas was silent for a long time, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the distant laughter of the children. He finally turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it was like looking into an open wound. "It was a mining dispute," he began, his voice low and heavy with memory. "A big company wanted a small family off their land. They hired us to enforce an eviction notice. The patriarch, a man named Abram, he was stubborn, proud. Like your Thomas, he'd built his life on that scrap of rock." He looked down at his hands, large and scarred, as if seeing them for the first time. "My partner at the time, he was like Jackson, impatient, cruel. He thought fear was the only tool we needed. I argued for time, for negotiation. I told Abram I'd try to get him a fair price for the land. He was considering it." Silas's voice grew thick. "We were supposed to go back the next day, but my partner went that night with a few company men. He wanted to scare them out. He set fire to the barn. But the wind shifted. The fire jumped to the house. Abram, his wife, their 2 children. They were all inside." He fell silent, the horror of the memory consuming him. "I arrived to see it burning against the night sky. I tried to get in. I got this," he said, his finger tracing the scar on his cheek, "from a falling beam. But it was too late. They were all gone." He finally looked at Alara, his soul bared. "I didn't pull the trigger. I didn't light the match. But I was part of the machine that did it. I stood by while a monster wearing a badge burned a family alive. I quit the next day. I came here to disappear. I figured a man like me deserved to be alone." Alara reached out and, without thinking, placed her hand over his. His skin was rough, but his hand was steady. "That man," she said, her voice firm. "The one who stood by, he doesn't exist anymore. The man I see saved my children from starvation. He gave us a home. He taught my son how to be a man and my daughter how to laugh again. The man I see is a good man." Silas, his stormy eyes locked with hers, and in their depths, a battle was being fought. He saw her belief in him, a belief he had never had in himself. He slowly, tentatively, turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound, elemental connection. Promise. A beginning. But as the last light of day vanished behind the mountains, a lone rider was making his way up the winding trail from the valley below. He was not a friend. He was a harbinger, a scout sent from the world they had tried to escape. He carried news that would shatter their fragile peace and force the warrior in Silas out of his self-imposed exile. The past was not finished with them yet. It was coming with fire and with fury to reclaim what it believed it owned. The rider, a hired man with shifty eyes and a desperate need for coin, arrived just as the moon crested the highest peak. He reined his horse in a short distance from the cabin, dismounting with a nervous energy. Silas was on his feet before the man had even taken 2 steps, appearing on the porch like a wraith, a rifle held loosely but readily in his hands. "That's far enough." Silas's voice cut through the night, sharp and cold as a razor. The man froze, his hands held high. "I ain't here for a fight," he stammered, his eyes wide. "I'm just a messenger from Mayor Thompson, in the town of Harmony." Alara, drawn by the voices, appeared in the doorway behind Silas, her face paling at the mention of the name. "He knows you're here," the messenger continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "He's got a warrant, issued by his judge, for theft. Says you stole jewelry and coin from his home before you fled." The lie was so audacious, so vile, it took Alara's breath away. "That's not true," she cried, stepping forward. Silas put a protective arm out, keeping her behind him. "What else?" Silas demanded, his voice dangerously low. "He's deputized a dozen men. They're riding out at dawn. He says he's coming to reclaim his property, both the stolen goods and the woman." The man's gaze flickered to Alara, a hint of pity in his eyes. "He also said to tell you, Silas, that he knows who you are. He knows about the fire. And he said that interfering with the law would be a very bad idea for a man with ghosts like yours." The threat was clear, a poisoned arrow aimed at the heart of Silas's deepest wound. The messenger, having delivered his payload of venom, backed away slowly. "I've done my part. What you do now is on you." He scrambled onto his horse and galloped back down the trail, swallowed by the darkness. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the sound of the wind whispering through the pines. The sanctuary had been breached. The world had found them. Alara sank onto the porch steps, her body trembling. "He'll take them," she whispered, her face a mask of terror. "He'll take my children." Silas stood for a long moment, the rifle still in his hand, his back ramrod straight. The messenger's words had hit their mark, dredging up the failure and shame he had tried to bury in this mountain soil. Thompson was using his past as a weapon, trying to paralyze him with guilt. But as he looked at Alara, at her terrified face, and thought of Leo and Clara sleeping peacefully inside, something shifted within him. It was not guilt that filled him, but a white-hot, cleansing rage. He was not that man anymore. He was not the man who stood by. He knelt in front of Alara, taking her trembling hands in his. "Listen to me," he said, his voice a steel cable of resolve. "He is not taking anyone. This is not his land. You are not his property. This is our home, and I will not let him or any other man touch it. I will not let them touch you." His words were a vow, an oath sworn in the moonlight. The fear in Alara's eyes was replaced by a flicker of his own defiant fire. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a haunted recluse, but the protector he was always meant to be. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady now. "We don't run," he said, standing up. "Not anymore. We fight." The rest of the night was a blur of frantic, purposeful activity. While Alara gathered water and food inside, barricading the single window with the heavy table, Silas worked outside. He used the darkness as his ally, his movements swift and silent. He set traps along the trail, deadfalls and snares, not designed to kill, but to slow them down, to break their confidence, to turn the forest they saw as a simple path into a hostile, unpredictable enemy. He reinforced the cabin door, wedging heavy timbers against it. He checked his rifle, his pistol, his ammunition, his actions precise and economical. This was a language he understood. It was the grim arithmetic of conflict, a calculus he had learned long ago and had prayed he would never have to use again. As the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, he stood with Alara in the dim light of the cabin. Leo and Clara were awake, their eyes wide with a fear they didn't understand. Alara hugged them close, whispering reassurances she didn't feel. "You should take the children," Silas said quietly, his face grim. "Go out the back through the creek bed. You can lose them in the high rocks. I can hold them off." Alara looked at him, her expression unyielding. "No," she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "You told me we don't run anymore. We started this together, we will finish it together. My whole life men have told me what to do, where to go, who to be. Not anymore. This is my home. This is my family. I am not leaving for a moment." Silas was speechless. He saw in her the same stubborn, unbreakable pride he had seen in Abram, the man he had failed to save. But this time he would not fail. He gave a single, sharp nod. "All right," he said. "Stay away from the window." He handed her a small pistol he kept as a backup. "You know how to use this?" She took it, her hand surprisingly steady. "My father taught me to shoot crows in the cornfield," she said, a grim smile touching her lips. "I'm a good shot." As the sun's first rays broke over the mountaintops, they heard it. The sound of horses, the jangle of harnesses, the coarse laughter of men who believe they are invincible. Mayor Thompson had arrived. The siege had begun. Mayor Thompson, a portly man with a face flushed with arrogance, reined in his horse at the edge of the clearing. He surveyed the small cabin with a contemptuous sneer. Behind him, a dozen rough-looking men, emboldened by the law and the promise of payment, spread out, their rifles ready. "Silas Kane," Thompson bellowed, his voice echoing in the crisp morning air. "I know you're in there. You are harboring a fugitive and stolen property. I have a legal warrant. Send out the woman and the children now, and I will let you walk away from this with your life." From within the cabin, There was only silence. Silas stood just inside the door, his rifle steady, his eye peering through a small crack in the logs. He could see them all, could count every man, could assess every threat. "He's bluffing," Alara whispered from across the room, where she was keeping the children low to the floor. "He won't let you walk away." "I know," Silas said, his voice calm. "He can't afford a witness." Thompson's face darkened with impatience. "I am giving you one last chance, Kane. Don't make me burn you out. I hear you have some experience with that." He laughed, a cruel, barking sound that made Alara's blood run cold. But the taunt had the opposite effect on Silas than Thompson intended. It did not fill him with fear or guilt. It incinerated what little remained of his past self, forging his resolve into something unbreakable. "Stay down," he said to Alara, and then, raising his voice, he called out, "Thompson, this is a private homestead. You are trespassing. Turn your men around and leave now." There will be no other warning. Thompson's face contorted in a mask of fury. "So be it. Boys, get ready." Two of his men, emboldened and foolish, spurred their horses forward, charging directly at the cabin. It was a fatal mistake. Silas's rifle cracked once, the sound sharp and definitive. One of the riders cried out and tumbled from his saddle, clutching a leg. The second rider's horse suddenly screamed and reared as it hit one of Silas's hidden snares, throwing its rider hard to the ground. The charge was broken before it had even truly begun. Chaos erupted among Thompson's men. They had expected a simple arrest, not organized, skilled resistance. They scrambled for cover behind trees, their bravado evaporating into nervous fear. "He's just one man," Thompson roared, trying to rally them. "Fire on the cabin." A volley of shots splintered the log walls, filling the small space with the smell of gunpowder and shattered pine. Leo and Clara cried out in fear, and Alara shielded them with her body, her heart pounding against her ribs. Silas remained as calm as the mountain stone. He didn't return fire wildly. He waited. He watched. He made every shot count. Another of Thompson's men, peering out from behind a tree, yelped as a bullet tore through the bark inches from his head, sending him scrambling back into cover. The forest, which had been their path to victory, was now a cage. The fight settled into a tense standoff. Hours crawled by. The sun climbed high in the sky. Thompson's men were pinned down, their morale sinking with every passing minute. They were hired guns, not soldiers, and their appetite for a prolonged fight against an unseen, deadly opponent was waning. Thompson, however, was consumed by his rage and humiliation. This was not just about a woman or a debt anymore. It was about his power, his authority, which was being defied by a single man in a log cabin. "Burn it!" he screamed, his voice hoarse with fury. "Burn them out." Two men, carrying torches and a can of kerosene, began to creep forward under the cover of their comrades' fire. This was the moment Silas had feared, the echo of his past nightmare made real. But this time was different. He was not a bystander. He fired, pinning the men with the torches down. But he couldn't be in two places at once. As he focused on them, another of Thompson's men saw an opportunity and broke from cover, sprinting toward the blind side of the cabin. "Silas, on the right!" Alara screamed, seeing the man through a tiny crack in the wall. Silas spun, but he was too late. The man was too close. Just as the man raised his rifle to fire through the unbarricaded back wall, the small pistol in Alara's hand barked. The sound was small compared to the rifles, but it was decisive. The man cried out, dropping his gun and clutching a wounded shoulder as he staggered back into the woods. Silas stared at Alara for a split second, a look of profound respect in his eyes. He had been so focused on protecting her, he had almost forgotten that she was a survivor, a fighter in her own right. Bolstered, he turned his attention back to the men with the torches. But just as the situation seemed its most desperate, a new sound echoed from down the trail, the thunder of hoofbeats, and not just a few. Over a dozen riders burst into the clearing, but they were not Thompson's men. They were the hard-bitten miners and homesteaders from the town of Redemption. At their lead was Jackson, Silas's old partner, his face grim and determined. He had seen Silas take in the starving family, had heard the whispers of Thompson's warrant, and his cynical heart had been stirred by a forgotten loyalty. He had ridden out to the mining camps and homesteads, telling them how Thompson had deputized thugs to drag a widow and her children back to a forced marriage, all under the false color of law. These were men who understood the tyranny of power, who had felt the boot of men like Thompson on their own necks. Thompson stared in disbelief as his hired guns found themselves surrounded. The tables had turned completely. The homesteaders, their faces set and hard, leveled their own rifles. "Mayor Thompson," Jackson called out, his voice carrying a newfound authority. "By the authority of the decent folk of this territory, you and your men are under arrest for conspiracy, illegal intimidation, and attempted murder." Thompson's face went from red to a pasty white. His power, built on fear and isolation, had crumbled the moment people decided to stand together. His men, seeing the overwhelming odds, threw down their weapons without a second thought. Their loyalty was only as deep as their pay. The fight was over. As the homesteaders disarmed the last of the hired guns and bound a sputtering, defeated Mayor Thompson, Silas finally unbarred the door. He stepped out into the sunlight, blinking. Alara followed, holding Leo and Clara by the hand. The clearing, moments before a battlefield, was now quiet except for the murmur of the townsfolk. Jackson walked over to Silas, a look of grudging respect on his face. "You were always the better man, Silas," he said gruffly. "Took me a while to see it." Silas simply nodded, his gaze finding Alara's. He walked to her, to his family. He knelt and pulled Leo and Clara into a fierce hug. He then stood and looked at Alara, his eyes saying everything his words could not. In the face of fire and death, they had not broken. They had stood together. They had won. They were home. What is it that turns a house into a home? Is it the wood and stone it's built from? Or is it the love and courage that defend it? What defines a family? Is it blood alone? Or is it the bond forged in shared struggle? The quiet promise to stand as one against the darkness? We've just walked with Alara and Silas on a journey from the depths of despair to the quiet strength of a hard-won peace. They reminded us that true strength isn't the power to dominate others, but the courage to protect them. They showed us that the past, no matter how painful, does not have to be a prison. It can be a lesson, a fire that forges us into someone better, someone stronger. In a world that often feels divided and cold, their story is a powerful reminder that community, courage, and compassion are the cornerstones of a life worth living. It teaches us that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is to simply build a home, to plant a garden, and to stand your ground for the people you love. Have you ever felt like you were at the end of your rope, only to find an unexpected kindness? Have you ever had to fight for the family you've chosen? If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the enduring power of hope and the strength of the human spirit, share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one, and your stories inspire us. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us that even in the harshest wilderness, love can find a place to put down roots and grow.